Visitors log at 3:47 p.m. steamer, not visible. Will verify at evening bell. That line appears in the lighthouse keeper's log at Whitefish Point, Lake Superior, on November 4th, 1869. It is written in the same steady hand that had recorded weather conditions and vessel passages for 3 years without error. But there was no steamer scheduled that day. No ship had been sighted from the tower, and when the evening bell rang at 6 o'clock, the keeper made no further entry about visitors. He did, however, note that the lamp oil was lower than it should have been, that the tower door had been left unlatched, and that he could not locate his walking stick, the one he kept always by the desk within arm's reach. The next entry, dated November 5th, begins. Slept poorly. Heard voices. Whitefish Point sits on the southeastern shore of Lake Superior, a finger of sand and stone reaching into water, so cold it does not give up its dead. In 1869, it was one of the loneliest posts on the Great Lakes. The nearest settlement, a fishing camp of perhaps 24 souls, lay 8 miles down a treacherous coastal path. The lighthouse itself was a whitewashed tower rising 60 feet above a keeper's cottage built from local timber and lake stone. In winter, ice formed on the windows thick enough to obscure the light. The keeper's name was Amos Ridley. He was 41 years old, a former merchant sailor who had left the open sea after losing 2 brothers to Lake Huron in a single October gale. He had been assigned to Whitefish Point in the spring of 1866. His wife had accompanied him for the first 2 seasons, but by 1869, she had returned to her sister's home in Sault Ste. Marie. The reasons for her departure are not detailed in any surviving letter, though a note in the lighthouse inspector's report from August of that year mentions that Mrs. Ridley had expressed concern over the isolation and her husband's nerves. Ridley lived alone at the point. His duties were simple: maintain the light, log all passing vessels, record weather conditions, and provide aid to any ship in distress. Supplies arrived by boat once a month during the navigation season, less frequently when ice began to form. He kept a garden in the brief summer, fished when the lake allowed, and read extensively. His logs reference Milton, the Bible, and a worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress. He was, by all official accounts, reliable. His logs were precise. His lamp was never dark. His correspondence with the lighthouse inspector was courteous and brief. Until November. The month began with clear skies and an early frost. On November 1st, Ridley noted the departure of the last lumber schooner of the season, the Clara Bronson, bound for Detroit. He observed that the birch trees along the western ridge had lost their leaves and that the lake was flat as hammered iron. On November 2nd, he recorded a temperature drop and the first skim ice forming in the shallows near the point. On November 3rd, he wrote only, "No traffic, wind northeast, clear," and then came November 4th. The log entry for that day begins normally enough. Morning temperature, wind direction, a note that he replaced a pane of glass in the lantern room. At midday, he recorded a brief snow squall that passed quickly, but at 3:47 p.m., the tone shifts. Visitors log at 3:47 p.m. steamer, not visible. Will verify at evening bell. There is no context, no description of who these visitors were, no mention of how they arrived. The lighthouse sat at the end of a long, exposed point, visible for miles in every direction. There was no dock, only a crude stone landing where supply boats unloaded goods into shallow water. Any approaching vessel would have been seen long before it arrived. Any person walking the coastal path would have been visible crossing the open sand flats. But Ridley logged visitors. The evening entry is stranger still. At 6 o'clock, when he would normally have noted the lighting of the beacon, he instead wrote, "Oil unexpectedly low. Door found open. Walking stick missing. No sign of departure." And then, as if adding a note to himself, "Did not hear them leave." The following day, November 5th, the log resumes in a hand that is slightly less steady. Slept poorly. Heard voices during the night. Could not determine direction. Believed they came from the tower, though I was alone in the cottage. Checked lamp twice. All secure. On November 6th, voices again. Distinctly heard at 2 a.m. and again near dawn. Sound like conversation, low and measured. When I light the candle, they stop. No further mention of visitors. No explanation of the missing stick. No steamer ever recorded as having passed the point that day. And yet the log continues to reference sounds, voices, footsteps, the scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor of the tower. By November 10th, Ridley had begun locking the tower door from the inside whenever he ascended to tend the lamp. The isolation of Whitefish Point in early November is difficult to convey. The navigation season was ending. The last boats had fled south ahead of the winter gales. The fishing camp 8 miles distant had been abandoned until spring. The forest beyond the lighthouse was old-growth pine and birch, dense and silent except for the wind. The lake itself was entering its most dangerous phase. Cold enough to kill in minutes, not yet frozen enough to walk upon. It was a landscape suspended between seasons, neither living nor dead. Ridley's log entries through mid-November show a man attempting to maintain routine in the face of something he cannot explain. He continues to record weather, temperature, the condition of the light. But woven through these dry observations are details that accumulate like frost on glass. November 11th. Woke to find the tower door unlatch again. I know I locked it. Footprints in the frost on the stairs. Ascending. Size and shape consistent with my own boots. I have been alone. November 13th. The voices are clearer now. I heard my name spoken twice last night. The second time, it came from directly behind me. I was sitting at this desk. My back was to the wall. November 15th. I have begun sleeping in the tower. The cottage feels compromised. I do not know how else to say it. The walls seem thinner. I hear movement in the rooms I have just left. When I return, everything is as I left it, but the air is different, warmer, as though someone has just passed through. It is important to note that Ridley does not describe fear in these entries, not directly. He does not write in exclamation points or desperate underlines. His handwriting remains controlled. But the content grows increasingly strange in the subtext. What he does not say begins to weigh more heavily than the words themselves. On November 17th, he mentions the oil again. Lamp oil is being consumed at an impossible rate. I filled the reservoir 3 days ago. It should last a week. This morning it was half empty. I have checked for leaks. There are none. I do not believe the lamp has been extinguished, even for a moment, yet the oil is vanishing. He follows this with a line that feels like confession. I have begun to suspect I am lighting the beacon for something other than ships. The next several entries are brief, almost clipped, as though Ridley is rationing his words. November 18th. They came again in the afternoon. I did not log the time. I heard them on the stairs while I was in the lantern room. Voices, at least 3, perhaps more. They spoke too quietly to distinguish words. I called down. The voices stopped. When I descended, the cottage was empty. The door was still locked from the inside. November 19th. I am certain now that they are not leaving. They simply stopped being heard. November 20th. Found my walking stick this morning. It was leaning against the outside of the tower on the lake side, where the rocks are too steep to stand. No footprints in the sand. No sign of how it got there. There is a 3-day gap in the log after this. The next entry is dated November 23rd, and the handwriting has changed. The letters are smaller, more cramped, as though written by candlelight with a hand that is cold or shaking. I no longer sleep. I do not mean that I sleep poorly. I mean I do not sleep at all. I sit in the lantern room and tend the light. I watch the lake. When I close my eyes, I hear them moving below me in the cottage, on the stairs, sometimes in the lantern room itself, just beyond the glass. But when I open my eyes, I am alone, except I am not alone. I know this now. I have known it since November 4th. I should not have logged them as visitors. That line, I should not have logged them as visitors, is the closest Ridley comes to explaining what happened on November 4th. But it is not an explanation. It is a retraction, an admission of error. But he does not say what he should have called them instead. The log continues. November 25th. I see them now in the peripheral, shapes that do not resolve when I turn my head. They stand at the edge of the light. I think they have always been there, but I have only recently learned to see them, or they have learned to be seen. November 27th. One of them wore my face. That entry stands alone on the page. There is nothing before it, nothing after it. Just that single line, centered in the middle of an otherwise blank space. On November 29th, the lighthouse inspector, a man named Thomas Hurley, arrived at Whitefish Point on an unscheduled visit. He had been en route to another station farther west when ice forced his boat to seek shelter. He noted later, in his official report, that he found the lighthouse in good operational order. The beacon was lit. The glass was clean. The logbook was up to date. But Ridley was not himself. Hurley described the keeper as gaunt and hoarse, with the appearance of a man who had not rested in some weeks. Ridley was polite but distant. He answered questions in short sentences. He did not invite Hurley into the cottage, conducting their conversation instead on the narrow porch, in a cold wind that came straight off the lake. When Hurley asked if everything was well, Ridley said, "The light has not gone dark." When Hurley asked if Ridley needed anything, Ridley said, "I need you to leave before evening." Hurley found this odd but not alarming. Lighthouse keepers were often eccentric, shaped by isolation and the weight of responsibility. He offered to stay the night, to share a meal, to provide company. Ridley refused. He insisted, with what Hurley described as an urgency bordering on rudeness, that the inspector depart before sunset. Hurley obliged. He left Whitefish Point at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and did not return until the following spring. The final entries in Ridley's log span the last 2 days of November. November 29th, written after Hurley's departure. He did not see them. I watched his face. He looked directly at the place where they stand, and he saw nothing. I do not know if this means they are not there, or if it means I am the only one they allow to see them. November 30th. They have stopped pretending to be visitors. And then, dated December 1st, 1869, the last line Amos Ridley ever wrote in the Whitefish Point log. They are in the light. What happened in the hours after that final entry is not recorded. There are no more logs, no letters, no witness testimony. But there are details, small and cold, recovered later. When the relief keeper arrived in early April of 1870, the lighthouse was still operational. The beacon had burned through the winter. The oil reserves were nearly full, far more than should have remained after 4 months of use. The tower was locked from the inside. The cottage showed no signs of disturbance. Dishes were washed and stacked. The stove was clean. The bed was made. Amos Ridley was not there. His coat was still hanging by the door. His boots were placed neatly beneath the coat. His personal effects, his books, his writing kit, his shaving razor, were all exactly where they should have been. The only thing missing was Ridley himself. And the logbook, the official lighthouse log, the one Ridley had kept faithfully for nearly 4 years, was gone. In its place, on the desk where the log should have been, was a different book, a blank ledger, and used, identical in size and binding to the missing log. It had been opened to the first page. On that page, in Ridley's handwriting, was a single sentence. Visitors logged at 3:47 p.m. steamer, not visible. Will verify at evening bell. The same line, word for word. The line that had begun everything on November 4th. But this was written in fresh ink. The page was clean. There were no other entries. Just that one line, copied onto a blank page, as though Ridley had started the log over, or as though something else had started it for him. The relief keeper, a young man named Samuel Worthy, reported the disappearance to the lighthouse inspector. A search was conducted. The shoreline was walked for miles in both directions. The fishing camp was checked, though it had been empty since autumn. The forest was examined, as far as men were willing to go into it. No trace of Amos Ridley was ever found. The Lighthouse Service ruled the disappearance an abandonment. This was not uncommon. Keepers sometimes broke under the isolation, walked away in the night, disappeared into the interior, or drowned themselves in the lake. Ridley's wife, when informed, said only that her husband had been troubled by the point and that she was not surprised he had left. But there were inconsistencies that the official report did not address. Ridley's boots and coat were still in the cottage. It was December. The temperature had been below freezing for weeks. No man walks away from a lighthouse in winter without boots or coat, not if he intends to survive. And then there was the oil. The reserve tanks, which had been nearly empty after 4 months of continuous burning, were almost full. The relief keeper noted this in his first report and was told not to worry about it. But he did worry. He checked the lamp mechanism, the fuel lines, the seals. Everything was in order. The light had burned all winter. The oil should have been gone. It was as though the lamp had been consuming something other than oil. Samuel Worthy kept the light at Whitefish Point for 2 seasons. He was efficient and unremarkable. His logs were brief and factual. He reported no unusual occurrences. But in a letter to his brother, dated October 1871, he mentioned that he did not like to be in the tower after dark and that he had taken to locking the lantern room door from the inside while he worked, even though there was no reason to do so. "It is only a feeling," he wrote, "but I cannot shake the sense that I am tending the light for an audience I cannot see." He requested a transfer in the spring of 1872 and was reassigned to a station on Lake Michigan. His replacement lasted less than a year. The keeper after that lasted 6 months. By 1875, Whitefish Point had gained a reputation as an undesirable post, a place where keepers did not stay long and did not speak much about why they left. In 1880, the Lighthouse Service rebuilt the tower at Whitefish Point, replacing Ridley's old structure with a taller, more modern design. The original cottage was torn down. The new keeper's quarters were built 100 yards farther from the shore. The official reason given was erosion, though the land had not noticeably changed. During the demolition, workers reported finding marks on the interior walls of the old tower. Scratches, they said, though they could not agree on what they looked like. Some said they resembled tally marks, as though someone had been counting. Others said they looked like letters, though they did not form words. One worker, in a statement given to the local newspaper, said the marks looked like names written over and over in a hand that became less and less steady the higher you climbed. None of these marks were photographed. The old tower was dismantled completely, and the stone was repurposed for the foundation of the new structure. The original lighthouse log, the one Ridley had kept, the one that vanished in December 1869, was never recovered. The blank ledger, with its single-copied line, was filed with the Lighthouse Service records and eventually transferred to the National Archives. It can still be seen there, preserved behind glass, open to that first page. Visitors logged at 3:47 p.m. steamer, not visible. Will verify at evening bell. No explanation accompanies it. The archival note identifies it only as Whitefish Point interim log, December 1869 to April 1870, author unknown. But there are other documents. In the Lighthouse Service's internal correspondence from 1871, there's a memo questioning the oil consumption rates at Whitefish Point. The station was using, on average, 30% less fuel than comparable lighthouses, despite burning the same hours. The inspector who wrote the memo suggested that the lamp mechanism might be more efficient than standard models and recommended that it be studied. No follow-up reports exist. In 1889, a journalist of the Detroit Free Press visited Whitefish Point and interviewed the keeper, a man named Virgil Stokes. Stokes mentioned, in passing, that he sometimes heard echoes in the tower, which he attributed to the acoustics of the stairwell. When pressed, he admitted that the echoes sometimes sounded like footsteps, and that he had developed the habit of announcing himself aloud whenever he entered the tower, so as not to be startled by the sound of my own movement. Reflected back, the journalist asked if Stokes had ever heard voices. Stokes paused, according to the article, and then said, "I do not stay in a tower longer than my duties require." He did not elaborate. Whitefish Point Lighthouse still stands. It is automated now, as all lighthouses are. There is no keeper. The light burns without human hands, guided by timers and sensors, indifferent to the dark. The station is a museum in the summer months. Visitors walk the tower, stand in the lantern room, look out over the lake. Some of them ask about Amos Ridley. The story of his disappearance has become a minor piece of local lore, mentioned in pamphlets, retold by tour guides. But the details have softened with time. He is described as a man who vanished mysteriously, or who may have walked out onto the ice and never returned. The logbook is not on display. In the archives, historians have occasionally examined the entries from November 1869, looking for explanations. Some have suggested that Ridley suffered a psychological break, brought on by isolation and the early onset of winter darkness. Others have noted the precise, controlled nature of his handwriting and argued that he was documenting something real, something he could not adequately describe. But there is no consensus. The entries are too strange to dismiss, too vague to confirm. And there's the matter of the oil. No one has ever explained why the reserves were still full in April 1870. The lamp burned. The records confirm it. The relief keeper saw the light from miles away as he approached. But the fuel that should have been consumed was still there in the tanks, untouched, as though the light had been burning on something else entirely. The Lighthouse service never officially investigated. The matter was noted, filed, and forgotten. Ridley was listed as missing, presumed dead, his wife remarried. His name appears in no further records. But there is one last detail, found in a letter written by Thomas Hurley, the lighthouse inspector, in 1873. He was writing to a colleague about staffing difficulties at remote stations. Near the end of the letter, almost as an aside, he mentioned Whitefish Point. "I have thought often of Ridley," Hurley wrote. "I was the last to see him, or so I am told. He seemed desperate for me to leave, though I did not understand why. I think now that he was trying to protect me from something, or perhaps he was trying to protect something from me. I do not know which troubles me more." Hurley continued, "I have not returned to Whitefish Point, though my duties have taken me near it several times. I find reasons to assign the inspections to others. I tell myself this is coincidence, but I do not believe it. There is a quality to that place, a stillness that is not peaceful. I felt it even in daylight, even with Ridley standing beside me. It was a feeling of being observed by something that had no reason to hide, because it knew you could not see it. Ridley saw it. I am sure of that now. And I think at the end it saw him back." The letter ends there. The lighthouse at Whitefish Point burns every night. It has never failed. The beacon sweeps across the water, regular and cold, marking the edge of the lake, warning ships away from the rocks. And sometimes, in the deep parts of winter, when the ice is thick and the light reflects off the frozen surface, people say you can see shapes moving near the base of the tower. Shadows that do not match the light. Figures that stand too still, for too long, in places where no one should be standing. But these are only stories. The logbook remains in the archives. The tower remains on the point. The light continues to burn. And somewhere in the records, filed and forgotten, is a single line that no one has ever been able to explain. Visitors logged at 3:47 p.m. steamer, not visible, will verify at evening bell. They were never verified. They never left. And the light has been burning for them ever since.